Good morning. Thank you all for coming here to the Orland Park Senior Coffee today, and thank you to everyone who's watching this on video via YouTube or via Facebook Live. Please email any comments that you have to publicinfooffice@orlandpark.org. Briefly, I'm going to start talking about public health, and I'm going to talk about our stats for COVID. The cases in Illinois, as you see, have increased from where they were, and they're not the most reliable indicator. And what shows that is Friday, September 4th, we had 5,300 in some cases, which far exceeds any amount of cases we ever had before. And at first, the state didn't acknowledge even why that happened. And if you look at that date, it's right before Labor Day, so it's somewhat intended to kind of frighten everybody. When at the end of the day, if you look at it, and you look at the next slide, you'll see that testing on that day was triple what it's been in the past. It was almost 150,000. So they had held back on reporting a lot of testing and then reported it all in one day. That's why cases are not the best indicator, because we don't have consistent testing and consistent reporting. So it's very hard to really use cases as a good indicator. And we have to remember that we were always looking to protect the healthcare system. That was what it was about. Also, if you look at testing percentages, and we hear a lot about test percentages, and that helps a little bit, you'll see that those have been low, and for the most part have been below 5% for all but a couple of days, and since about the beginning of June. So it's been for a long time that we've had pretty low test percentages. What we really need to look at is hospitalizations due to COVID, because what do we know? We know when someone's hospitalized. We know the date they go to the hospital. We also know the day that if they test positive for COVID or not. So those two things are actually known facts that we can track. And again, we're trying to protect the hospital system. So that's why that statistic is what I've been looking at for the entire time, really been paying attention to, because it really tells you what's happening. Even if we had 10,000 cases, it wouldn't matter if we have no one in the hospital, because those cases aren't serious. So if you look at hospitalizations, and this was cut straight from the Cook County website today, you'll see hospitalizations by report date. And if you look at the black line, that's a 7-day moving average. And that 7-day moving average shows that cases have been below 10 for over 3 months. And they've actually decreased now by about 20 to 30% in the last week. So they're actually declining. But they've stayed very flat. And essentially, our hospital system's not stressed at all. In fact, it's pretty empty. So in the big scheme of things, that's an important thing to look at. And while daily cases have remained low in Orland Park, as you can see here, and actually those are trending downward too. They've been about 8, 9, 10 a day since about the middle of July or the beginning of July, and they've dropped down more recently to about 6 or 7 a day in the last week to 10 days. The testing, as you can see, has gone up dramatically during that time as well. So we're doing very well. The other thing that should be known about cases is that any kids that are off at college, those are counting as cases against Orland Park as well, because that's their home address. Flip to the next slide. So one of the things, I know we've been briefed on this a little bit, but I know that the infectious disease specialists talk about days to double. Right, Doc? Right, and so if you look at Orland Park and you go back, you'll see that the latest doubling, it was 72 days. Before that, it was 60 days. Before that, it was 21 days. So it's the spread of COVID is slowing. So that's all good news. And right now, at the pace we're at now, it's going to take 182 days to double again if we continue to have the caseload we've had. Flip to the next slide. So this is Cook County data, and it shows. This is right from their page. These are the metrics that the state uses, and it shows that our region, which is the bulk of our town, like 95% of our town is in this region, that all the numbers look good. We're back down as far as test positivity, hospitalization admissions, and then obviously we're worried about how many beds are available, ICU beds are available. This is Region 7, which is different than Region 10 because this is our emergency response region. This is what we fall in. And ICU beds and ventilators are well above the thresholds that they're looking for that. So again, we're pretty healthy on that as well. Interestingly, we've been tracking for the last 20 plus days since kids were going back to school, we kind of wanted to see what was going on by age. So we started tracking this. And the difficulty with tracking all of this is you actually have to track it every day. Otherwise, because it's always reported cumulatively, it's never each day. So we have to actually track it every day so that we can back into what those are. And if you look back in the last 26 days since we've been tracking it by age, only about 4% of the cases are people over 70. Which is very good news because obviously that's our most vulnerable population. As we know, in Orland Park there's been 37 deaths, the average age is 84, and only two of those deaths are in the 60s, the rest are over 70. So obviously this is important to note that the really vulnerable populations are doing a great job of not picking this up anymore and protecting themselves. And Orland Park has done a great job in general. Not surprisingly, younger people are getting it more. Some of that's due to going back to college and obviously going back to school. We may see a little bit of that. Here's the really good news is if you look at Orland Park, and we've talked about how open we've been, we opened our parks earlier, we opened our restaurants earlier, we have the concerts we've done, and our staff's done an amazing job of making sure those were all done safely. We did our Taste of Orland, we've done all of that, and our case rate is less than the state case rate, which includes the counties that don't have a lot of cases. It's way less than the rest of suburban Cook County, and obviously far less than Chicago, where the density is higher and the case rates are much higher. So we've done a really good job in Orland Park of keeping you, I think we've done a good job of keeping you informed, putting on our events safely, and then our residents, our businesses have done a good job of complying with the recommendations that we give and keeping themselves safe. Flip to the next slide. And now I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Ankur David and Amy Balcaitis.
So when you talk about respiratory illnesses, it starts, this is sort of the respiratory tract. So again, when you get a runny nose, depending on where the infection is, how far it goes, that's where your symptoms are. So when you have a runny nose, it starts in the nose. When you get a sore throat, it's a little lower in the pharynx, which is called pharyngitis. As it goes down, when you start having a cough, that means infections more in the lower respiratory tract, the bronchitis, I'm sure you guys have heard the word bronchitis. And then when it gets into the lungs itself, that's when it's called pneumonia. Terminology is sort of important. A lot of times I've had people say, like, I don't really know what that means. So when the infection goes down to the lungs, that's when you start having shortness of breath. And that's when you call it pneumonia. So next slide. There's lots of different viruses that can cause respiratory illnesses. These are some of the most common ones. You have respiratory syncytial virus, or RSV. The other is human metapneumovirus. You have respiratory adenovirus. I'll explain that a little bit more. Then we have human parainfluenza virus. Then obviously the influenza and the coronaviruses. So next slide. So RSV, again, cold-like symptoms is one of the most common things that causes those. It affects the very young children a lot more severely. A lot of times, older kids and adults feel okay. Again, symptoms depending on where the infection is. You can get a runny nose, cough, pharyngitis. A lot of times you can get, fatigue, fever. That's more systemic signs of those symptoms, depending on how severe the infection is and how, aggressively your body responds to it, how strong your immune response is. Most people do okay with this. Like I said, it adversely affects more young infants. You hear this on the news a lot too, the RSV virus. It affects, hospitalization for kids and all that. So next slide. The next is human metapneumovirus. Again, causes lower and upper respiratory tract infection. So again, sore throat, runny nose. If it gets to the lungs, pneumonia, shortness of breath, etc. And usually, again, most people do okay with this. People who have underlying immune problems or underlying lung diseases are at higher risk for getting more severe illnesses like pneumonia. Next slide. So then you have the respiratory adenovirus. So there's about 50 different types of adenoviruses, and they can cause respiratory illnesses. Certain ones can cause stomach problems like nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, conjunctivitis if it affects the eyes, and also very rarely, but they can also cause meningitis, so neurological issues as well. But most commonly, those viruses cause respiratory illnesses. And again, this is one of those viruses that is a little bit more robust as far as surviving on foreign objects, doorknobs, and things like that. So cleaning it so it's somewhat easily spread through contact a little bit more than other viruses. Next slide. Then we have the human parainfluenza virus. As the name suggests, kind of similar to influenza, but there's, again, 4 different types. Type 4 is the one that usually, is not that readily recognized. Type 1 and 2, again, very similar, very much like all the other respiratory viruses. Depending on where the infection is, it can cause anything from a mild runny nose to pneumonia and shortness of breath and all of that. So next slide. And then we have influenza. Now we're sort of getting into the more severe, influenza, as you know, or also known as the flu, usually causes a lot more severe illnesses. This is the one that people get really they feel symptoms-wise, they have a lot of systemic symptoms as well. You'd be surprised how many times I hear, "Doc, I just feel like I got hit by a bus." That's the flu. You get really run down, you get a lot of high fevers. You still have some of the other symptoms as well, like runny nose, cough. Usually it's caused by 2 different viruses, influenza type A and type B. There are a lot of other types, but those are sort of the most clinically relevant. And we'll go to the next slide. So again, all the other, we usually try to differentiate flu from the cold so that you know when to sort of seek help and when to get tested. A lot of these, it's hard to tell apart clinically. Sometimes you need a test to see what's going on, just because a lot of these can also cause mild symptoms, and especially the flu, and obviously we'll talk about the COVID-19, can cause very severe illnesses as well. So testing is probably the best way to differentiate between those. Sometimes the symptoms help, sometimes they don't. The common symptoms, again, fever, cough, sore throat, runny nose, muscle aches, body aches, headache, and then very rarely, more so in kids, they get nausea, vomiting, and stomach issues, but usually for the most part it's respiratory illnesses. Next slide. So again, this is something that is from the CDC's website. So you have a cold, which usually accounts for all the other viruses, and there are a few more that aren't mentioned up there. And then you have the flu, which causes a little bit more severe illness. So again, gradual onset of symptoms with the cold. It's pretty abrupt, going back to that analogy, like, "Doc, I was feeling fine, all of a sudden I got hit by a bus. I feel really run down, I feel really tired, I have fevers, my whole body hurts, I have chills, I feel really tired," and all of those other symptoms that I mentioned up there. So next. So then we come to the coronavirus. This is something, that they first identified in the 1960s. There are a lot of different strains of coronavirus out there. There are 7 very common ones that infect, well, not so common, but there's the 4 ones that are listed on this slide are the most common ones that we sort of encounter. Again, all of these cause just cold symptoms, very mild infection. Next slide. And then you have, sometimes people, certain viruses who typically just infect animals can mutate, and they develop certain properties that can affect humans. So if you look at this slide, there are, including the new coronavirus, this was SARS-CoV-2, there was MERS, and then there was SARS, the first coronavirus. And both of those, and all 3 of these tend to cause, in certain population, more severe illnesses, more severe disease, respiratory failure, a lot more pneumonias and complications of that. So we could go to the next slide. So, influenza versus COVID-19. So what I'm trying to do is sort of, where are they similar, where are they different? And a lot of times, as far as the symptom goes, like I mentioned before, depending on how far the infection has traveled, how much, how severe the infection is, it can vary from simply, I'm sure a lot of people just had a runny nose. Taking care of a lot of people, they occasionally get tested and like, I got tested positive for COVID-19, but I feel fine. And then you have, obviously we've seen a lot of people who are also hospitalized, who are on the ventilators because they have a very severe illness. So for the most part, the symptoms are very similar. That's why testing is important. The biggest difference so far that we've noticed, and for the COVID-19 symptoms, a lot of people have complained of losing their taste and smell, which is not commonly reported with the flu. So that's sort of one thing that sort of helps to differentiate, but a lot of times you just need to test before we know. Next slide. Then we have, again, complications. Very similar complications for both. Again, can affect your respiratory. It can, in cases of very severe illness, can lead to multi-system organ failure and even death. And both of them can, make you susceptible to having bacterial infections on top. A lot of these, viral infections don't need antibiotics. People say, I have a sore throat, runny nose. Most doctors will not prescribe antibiotics because they help against bacteria. Does nothing for these viruses, and your body's actually pretty good at recovering and taking care of it. But with the flu and with the COVID, you are at a risk for having a secondary infection. So your lungs are a little bit vulnerable, and then the bacterial infection can set in. So in which case, that's when the need for antibiotics come in. The difference, with COVID-19, we are seeing blood clots. People develop blood clots either in their legs or their lungs. They're what we call hypercoagulable, which is something that's a little bit different that we don't see with the flu. And then in kids, we're seeing this phenomenon called multi-system inflammatory syndrome in children. I do want to enforce that it's very rare. Most kids don't have symptoms. Most of them do okay, even if they get COVID. But this is something that they have noticed, and which is not sort of commonly seen in kids with flu. Next slide. And so treatment, this is where things are a little bit, different. Most treatments for both are focused on symptoms. If you have a cough, you take cough medicine. If you have a fever, you take medicines for fever. If you get really short of breath, you have severe disease, you can, if you need oxygen to help you breathe better, you do that. That's all similar for both of them. Where things get a little bit different is the flu's been around for a while. And we have medicines that, if we use early enough, can protect you and help progress you from getting severe disease. And obviously, there's a vaccine for the flu. It's not the best. It varies, and depending on the strain that pops up every year, how much it protects varies. But it is available, and I definitely recommend everybody take the flu shot. Right now, as far as COVID-19 goes, there is really no FDA-approved therapies for it. There are a few medications which, small studies have shown that may be effective. So what the government has done is sort of authorize it under emergency use authorization, which basically means we think it helps. We're not 100% sure, but this is all we have right now, which includes, I'm sure if you guys follow the news, has remdesivir, convalescent plasma. One of the best medications that have been around for a while and has shown to help the most is steroids or Decadron, which people take for many other reasons. Mainly it helps cut down on how much swelling is going on when the infection's there, to help people breathe better, and that's been the most promising medicine to help people with the COVID-19. We also use it for the flu as well when they get really sick with their lungs. So next slide. So now I'm going to turn it over to Amy and sort of how to protect ourselves and how to prevent this.
Good morning. I tend to talk soft, so let me know if you can't hear me. But I'm going to talk to you about prevention. A lot of these things are things you've probably been doing for the past few months. These illnesses, flu and COVID, are both respiratory illnesses, so the prevention measures are similar for both. The flu, we know, we anticipate the flu every fall. We look forward to it dissipating every spring, but COVID-19 is new. Like Dr. Dabby said, we're learning new stuff all the time. So I'm going to preface this with, this is what we know right now. Next slide. The chain of infection is important to understand when you think about prevention. You start with your infectious agent. So in this case we have influenza and we have COVID-19. And they need a reservoir, so it's somewhere to replicate. So you have a host, it replicates in your body, then it looks for a way to get out and to spread to other people. So both of these viruses are spread by respiratory droplets that are produced when someone talks, sings, coughs, sneezes. They travel through the air, they land on the nose and the mouth of someone who's susceptible, and then that chain of infection starts all over again. So a susceptible host is someone who, in terms of influenza, it's someone who maybe hasn't had the flu vaccine. For COVID-19, it's someone who hasn't had the infection yet. Next slide. So this shows a picture of respiratory droplets. We have our large droplets, small droplets, and aerosols. So influenza and COVID-19 are spread by droplets, and they can travel through the air certain distances, but not more than 6 feet before they fall to the ground. So social distancing is important. You need that proximity in order to transmit the infection. There is some studies that show that it can be spread by aerosol. There are certain medical procedures where aerosols are created, which puts healthcare providers at a greater risk. And there's also some studies that show that if there's a lot of people, a densely populated area with poor ventilation, that there can be some aerosolization and some spread as well. Next slide. So this is a picture that shows why ventilation is important. The top slide shows an area with poor ventilation. The bottom slide shows better ventilation. So like I said, there are some studies that show that in poorly ventilated areas there have been clusters of transmission. Hospitals tend to have good ventilation. We're constantly monitoring things like airflow, temperature, and humidity. And these are things that typically aren't done in restaurants or retail stores. So things that can be done to help improve ventilation are opening doors, opening windows. You know, we live in the Midwest. We know we probably can't do that for too much longer. But limiting the number of people that are in an enclosed space is also good. Next slide. So masking. Masking, the importance is twofold. It protects other people from respiratory droplets that are spread from your nose and mouth. And it also provides a barrier that covers your nose and mouth and prevents other people's droplets from landing on you and infecting you. So the governor of Illinois had issued an executive order a while back mandating that anyone 2 years of age and older wear a mask when they're out in public. It's recommended when social distancing isn't feasible and when you're around people who don't live in your household. The mask really is not a substitute for social distancing, though, so it's important to remember that. So cloth masks are fine. The important thing with cloth masks is that they recommend there's at least 2 layers of fabric. You want to have a fabric that's breathable, obviously a cotton or polyester rather than something that's vinyl. And they should be washed regularly in the hottest water that is recommended for that fabric, just using regular detergent. Next slide. So this is just a visual on the importance of masking. If you're around someone who's infected, people can be infected for up to a day or two without showing any symptoms and without even knowing that they're sick. So if you have someone who is infected, they're not masked, you're not masked, you're going to be at maximum exposure for getting an infection. If you're both masked, it provides the highest level of protection. Next slide. So there are also best practice recommendations for how to mask. So it's recommended that you wash your hands before and after touching your mask. There's a clean area on the mask, so if you have a mask with ear loops, that's the clean area, or if there's ties that tie behind your head, those are the areas that you're going to want to touch when you're handling your mask. The front of the mask is going to be the most infected, so if you are touching or adjusting your mask, you're going to want to make sure that you wash your hands. I don't think I realized how much I touch my face until COVID happened, and I'm trying to teach my kids and they're trying to teach me every time I touch my face. It's important that it covers both your nose and your mouth. If it just covers your mouth and your nose is exposed, it can make you vulnerable, and it can also leave others vulnerable to your droplets that might come out of your nose. You want to secure it under your chin and secure it to your face, minimize the amount of gapping. If you have a mask that has the wire bridge that goes over your nose, just push that down so it creates a better seal on your face. When you remove the mask too, it's recommended if you're going to put it in your purse or your pocket, fold the outside of the mask in on itself, so the outside is touching the outside. Next slide. So indirect transmission, there is some evidence that shows that indirect transmission may play a role with COVID. So if you have someone who's susceptible, who coughs or touches objects that's shared by other people, there is a risk that someone can pick up that virus on their hands, touch their eyes, nose, or mouth, and potentially become infected. And it's important to realize too that this can happen whether or not you're wearing gloves. So gloves often give people a false sense of security. The CDC does not recommend wearing gloves when you're out in public and running errands. The most important thing you can do is to just wash your hands and to be aware of what you're touching. Next slide. So this kind of goes over some of the time frames that studies have shown that COVID-19 can live on surfaces. It doesn't tend to live as long on soft or porous surfaces, up to 24 hours on cardboard, but it has been shown to be able to be isolated from harder porous surfaces for longer periods of time. So when we look at plastic, when we look at metal, up to 3 days. But it's important to note that the viral load on those objects decreases very quickly. So although it might be on an object, you might pick it up on your hands, it might not be enough to make you sick, but there's really not a whole lot of evidence right now. So just something to be aware of. Next slide. So like I said, hand hygiene is probably one of the most important things we can do. It's the most important thing you can do to reduce your risk of any infection. If you can wash your hands with soap and water, make sure we're doing it for at least 20 seconds. If we use alcohol-based hand sanitizer, it's recommended that it have at least 60% alcohol content. And just be aware that there are certain areas of our hands that are missed most often when we wash, the thumbs and the tips of our fingers. And just again, avoid touching your eyes, nose, and mouth with unwashed hands. Next slide. So like Dr. Davi said, the flu vaccination is really important this year. It provides a number of benefits. It helps protect you and the ones you love from getting the flu. It helps to lessen the duration of illness if you do get the flu and the severity of symptoms. And it also helps potentially to reduce the burden on the healthcare system, which is really important, especially this year in the middle of a pandemic. The composition of the flu vaccine is usually effective against 3 or 4 strains. I think most are 4 now, quadrivalent. And there is a high-dose vaccine that is available for people 65 years and older, and it contains 4 times the antigen, which is the part of the vaccine that helps you build up the immune response. So that may be something to talk about with your physician. The timing of the flu vaccine too, like Dr. Dave says, it does lose some effectiveness over time. So you don't want to get it too early. July, August is really probably too early to get it. September, October is great. If it's still December, January, you haven't gotten it and you want to get it, you can still get that. As long as the flu viruses are still circulating, that's fine. Next slide. So this is just kind of a recap of what we talked about. Monitor your health. If you're sick, don't go out. Don't be around others who are sick. Make sure you're wearing your mask out in public, covering your nose and your mouth, washing your hands frequently, disinfecting frequently touched surfaces because of that possible indirect transmission risk. And then finally, finding healthy ways to cope with stress. Like Mayor Pekau said, this is not the way we normally do things. It sometimes feels like we're more isolated from our families and those that we care about. So finding groups in your community or your church that you can safely engage in is important. And that's all I have. Do we have time for questions?
Yeah, we have time for questions. And I have 1 or 2 myself. Does anybody here have questions? So this is for you, Dr. Dowdy. You discussed kids contracting COVID. Can you comment on what current scientific consensus is on kids transmitting COVID to elder family members? Are transmission rates from kids to elders different than from adults to elders?
That's a good question. I mean, most of this is related to So from what we find out so far, kids are more likely to have mild illnesses, and so which puts them at more likely to spread it to other people, because a lot of times we focus on symptoms. If they don't have symptoms or they don't get tested, they don't know they have it, and they can spread it to other people. As far as their risk for spreading it to elderly, it really just depends on if they're around elderly people. So if they're not around elderly people, obviously they can't spread it to them. Which is why this whole concept of universal masking is there, because you don't know, and that's why this is probably the best way to protect everyone. But as far as there's no really studies that say kids are more able to spread it more to elderly or anything like that. We know they're able to spread it more mainly because they don't have symptoms, or they have very mild symptoms, and kids being kids, they don't make much of it, they don't get tested. And so that's sort of the mode of transmission. It really doesn't have to do with age or anything like that.
I think there's a question over here.
The holiday season is rapidly approaching, and Thanksgiving, with family members that are outside of your household that may come over and visit you. What do you recommend in terms of the size of the number of people in your home for a Thanksgiving or a Christmas dinner?
Yeah, that's all that difficult to answer. I mean, obviously, what I would, family time is important, getting together is important. The best thing is to protect the vulnerable. I mean, a lot of it depends on how big the house is. It's going to be winter. Odds are we're not going to be able to keep the windows open or anything like that. And so that's a little bit of a difficult question to answer. Usually, common sense is you try to limit as many people as you can, and you try to limit vulnerable people from getting exposed. I don't know if by then it'll be feasible to test and then come, although it gets a little bit awkward, I understand that. But that's probably, it depends on how big the house is and all that. But what I would recommend is, the people who are more vulnerable, who have underlying lung disease, or who are really elderly, should, take proper precautions before getting together for the holidays. I mean, we have seen spikes in COVID-19 during, let's say, when we have 4th of July, we did notice some spikes because of, family getting together and all that. So, the precautions Amy talked about are very important.
Thank you.
So, Doctor, one of the things that I've learned through all of this, and obviously I've probably been paying as much attention or more than most of the people here, except for the two of you, to all of this with an entire town that we're responsible for, is really how dangerous the flu is, because we've been vaccinating for decades against the flu. We've all been exposed to it our entire life, and look what the flu does to a bad flu season, how many people it can kill in the United States. So can you comment on how important it is to take these precautions like social distancing, washing your hands, and those hygiene for the flu, because the combination of flu and coronavirus could be very bad?
Yeah, so like we mentioned before, the same precautions you take for the coronavirus will also protect you for the flu. So if we keep doing what we're doing, I don't anticipate a very bad flu season. Again, I don't have a crystal ball, but usually it's this very similar mode of transmission. So if we're taking the same precautions that we do for respiratory illnesses, and that's how they're spread, and if we keep doing the masking and keep focusing on that, I don't think the flu season will be as bad as what we, certain ones before. It's very complicated as far as, when a flu season causes a lot of mortality, and a lot of it has to do with the virus itself. It's a little bit complicated, but there's a lot of different antigens, a lot of different strains, and the vaccine can only protect you against so many. So if there's a strain that is not well covered by the vaccine, it may protect partial immunity, which can lead to more people getting sick. And I think this is sort of what they've noticed in certain other countries as well, because of all the precautions they've taken for the COVID-19, the flu, they haven't seen as many flu cases either. And I think that's probably, it should hold true. Again, I've been surprised before, but in theory, that should hold true here as well.
And one last question that I have for you is that, it appears from all of the data, we know in Illinois 55% of the deaths have come from long-term care facilities where people tend to be ill to begin with. And we've also seen that, predominantly those that die from coronavirus have other comorbidities with it. So can you talk a little bit about staying home when you're sick and protecting yourself if you're ill with something, particularly if you have a compromised immune system or are elderly?
Yeah, I mean, that's very important. So if you notice how many people died earlier on, if you look at the age of, the mean age of people who died earlier on, we had a lot more mortality I think for two reasons. One is this was a new virus. We're still learning on how to treat people with it, how to take care of it. And the other is, I mentioned, older people got sick at the beginning. Now, the mean age that you look at is probably about 15 years younger than what it was 3 to 4 months ago. So yes, that's why the elderly are at higher risk. The biggest thing we've noticed, if you have diabetes, if you have obesity, those people are at even higher risk for developing severe illnesses. So definitely if you're feeling sick, if you're not well, you should stay home to protect others. The other thing is, if you're feeling really sick, I think the sooner you get to a hospital, so don't let things go too far. That's something that I've noticed where people have come into the hospital. Sometimes it's a little bit too late, their disease has progressed a lot more. I mean, the more evidence is, the sooner you get help, the sooner you get started on some of these treatments, the better it is for you. So if you feel short of breath, I think that's the biggest sign. Let's say you were able to do okay, now you're able to get up, walk to the bathroom, and you kind of feel winded or all that. If you have fevers, if you feel short of breath, I would recommend seeking help sooner rather than later. That way, at least when you're in the hospital, you're already isolated, you're not able to spread it to other people, and you get the help you need in a timely manner. That goes for the flu as well, and for COVID as well. The sooner we know about it, the sooner we can help.
Are there any other questions?
Yes, sir.
It always seems that I read articles about people recovering from the virus, and that kind of at the end of the article, they say, well, there's a small percentage of people who have permanent symptoms or damage. In your estimation, experience, and anecdotal guess, what percentage do you think that is?
It's hard for me to put a number on that, mainly because, patients, I see them mostly in the hospital. They get discharged, and I don't know, to a lot of them, what happens when they get discharged. But I know, usually the complications are directly related to the severity of the illness. So those people who've been in the respirator, those people who've been in the ICU, develop a lot of these complications that you're talking about, these neurological complications that you read about. And that's sort of a result of the virus itself, as well as sometimes the steroids that we use and the medications we use. A lot of times we have to paralyze people because they fight the vents and other reasons. So I think those complications are directly related to how severe their initial illness was. It's hard for me to put a number, and I haven't seen a lot of studies, again, because we've had this virus around for a few months now, about 8 months or so. So that's something that they will look at further down the line to see how many percentage of people have prolonged, life. We don't even know if the lung damage that's happened, if that's permanent or if people recover. My guess is it's probably going to be somewhere in the middle where, depending on how healthy your lungs were and how severe your infection was, some people are going to do better than others. I know there was, if you remember, this was maybe a few months ago, Northwestern ended up doing the first double lung transplant in a COVID patient. Well, that was a young patient who had a very severe illness, and they had to do a lung transplant because there's no way she was going to recover from this. And so that, putting a percentage number is going to be a little bit difficult for me to do right now. We don't have those full studies. But I can say it mainly depends on how severe your illness was to begin with. Which is why I think it's important, if you don't feel well, it's better to seek help sooner rather than later.
I want to thank you both for coming. Really appreciate it. I think this information is very helpful. Thanks again for coming out today and taking your time, taking time out of your day to educate our seniors, and this is going to be up, even for those who aren't seeing it live, they'll be able to see a replay of it. So this information will be really helpful. So, and we appreciate, and I appreciate all of the information you've given us throughout this entire ordeal that we've been dealing with for the last 6 months. So now we're going to move on to public safety, and the rest of the questions we'll wait till the end. So for the various things that we're talking about. And at this point, I'm going to turn it over to our new Chief of Police, Chief Joe Mitchell.
All right, thanks, Mayor. Very rare for the police department to have good news, but we got good news for you today. So the mayor asked me to come out and talk about the state of the village regarding the crime. We spoke at what we provided the FBI are 10 subcategories of crime under 2 components. The first component is crimes against person. Those are the homicides, those are the rapes, those are the robberies, those are the aggravated battery, the aggravated assaults, okay? The second category is crimes against property. Those are the burglaries, those are the thefts, those are the motor vehicle thefts, as well as the arsons. So if you go ahead and click to the next slide, please. So in 2019, from January to August, we had a total of 652 crimes that we reported to the FBI. This year we had 431. So we're looking at about a 34% decrease in number of crimes that occurred in Orland Park. So what's driving that? Go ahead and send the next slide. Thefts. Thefts is the primary category that we report to the FBI due to the fact that we have over 12 million square feet of retail sales property. So well over 200 thefts have been gone down, in particular with the Orland Square Mall. What's interesting to know is our burglaries are way down. This is something that you play a role in, and that's the roost burglaries. Typically, we got about 4 to 5 burglaries per year involving people that pretend to work for NICOR, ComEd, a plumber, an electrician. They gain access to your home, and they distract you while another individual goes in and steals stuff out of your bedrooms and other rooms. So this year we had 2 of them, and we were able to catch 3 individuals responsible for one of those acts because people like you were aware and reported immediately to the police. So we're looking at about over 60% decrease in number of burglaries this year compared to last year, so that's substantial. But one thing we're showing an increase is the motor vehicle thefts. That's something that's frustrating for the police department because we have a campaign that lock it or lose it. We have something on social media. We put things out with Post-its. I'm sure some of you guys had a Post-it on your car at some point during the last year. It says, please lock your vehicle. Majority of these, well over 90% of those were involving vehicles that were left unlocked and the keys were left in the vehicle. These are called crimes of opportunity. We got to be better about that, okay? So that's our issue this year, and something we're going to address continuing through this year and next year about making sure people lock their cars and leaving their car keys either in their pocket or in their home. Next slide, please. So violent crimes. We did have 1 criminal homicide this year. Unfortunately, we had a small child that was killed in a crash at 151st and Harlem Avenue back in January. It was a snowstorm. An individual was driving excessive during the snowstorm, and the child perished, unfortunately. This year, we have no reported rapes up to August. We did have 4 robberies. We did have a robbery in September, an armed robbery that occurred over by Norm's Cleaners. We are on that investigation. I will tell you that we did help effect an arrest in Indiana on a situation with that. That person's a person of interest in our case, okay? So we're wrapping that case up currently. But the biggest increase is aggravated assault and aggravated batteries this year. And let's talk about that. Go to the next slide, please. This year, We're seeing an increase in domestic-related aggravated batteries and assaults, violence within the home. Husband versus wife, brother versus sister, brother versus brother, child versus grandparent. A lot of this we think is associated with COVID. People are having cabin fever, they're frustrated sitting at home, resulting in more domestic-related calls for service. The other issue is attack on my officers. People out there in the community are just quite disrespectful at times to our officers, and we've seen an increased number of injuries resulting from that. Just from May till now, we've seen a 26% increase in the number of people resisting arrests, lawful arrests resisting. So it's kind of an epidemic currently, and we're trying to resolve some of that issue. Go ahead to the next slide, please. So these are the index crimes. Remember the 10 subcategories we talked about? In 2019, we had a total of 974. That is the lowest we've ever had in 25 years in Orland Park. So we're quite proud of that. And the reason why we have that is such great support from the mayor and the board and the village manager. They've been phenomenal to us, truly, providing with everything we need, all the resources we need to go out there and keep the community safe. So let's look at the next slide. So this is where the rubber meets the road, ladies and gentlemen. This is the clearance of arrests. The FBI tabulates all clearance rates throughout the entire United States, and that's under the national there, the green one, and that's the clearance rates for homicides, for robberies, and for aggravated assaults. We didn't have any rapes this year, so that's why I didn't put it on there. We have 100% clearance on our homicides, 75% clearance on our robberies, and 100% on our aggravated assault and batteries, far exceeding not only the national level, but the Midwest level. So we're quite proud of that.
Thank you, Chief. And as the Chief just showed, what a great job that our police department does, and you can go to the next slide. Yeah, we do provide a lot of support. The previous boards have provided a lot of support. This is a long history of these efforts, and it's also, as you see, Chief Mitchell going from deputy chief to chief. It's because why would we go outside of our police department when we have developed such a great police department with leadership like Chief Mitchell's? So he's going to be a phenomenal chief and has been so far. So I want to reiterate the index crimes because you can see from 2016 to 2019 how big that drop was. It was 35% drop in those 3 years at crime at Orland Square. So we all know, I don't think anyone here doesn't think that there aren't more crime pressures. I mean, 10,000 criminals were let out of Cook County Jail. Those people are out there committing crimes. We know about the rioting and looting. We see it all the time. You see it on social media all the time. You have some people on social media that I think they spend their life just trying to scare everybody to death because it's out there now. Crime is still less than it used to be. Just because you hear about it more doesn't mean that there's more of it. But that also doesn't mean that we aren't realists. There are people out there trying to break into cars. There are people trying to do that. It's the fact that we're so proactive with our police department that we get these campaigns out there. We're partnered with neighboring communities for the car thefts, for example. We're partnered on major crimes with the neighboring communities. And the other thing, the previous slide showed, we clear cases. Criminals know they're going to get caught if they come here. That's largely what helps keep that crime down. So we've done a great job with that, as you can see. We also had the lowest number of crimes against person in 2014, 16, and 18, and we were number 2 in 15 and 17. I haven't seen the 2019 comparisons yet, but I'm guessing since it was so low last year that we're probably going to be number 1 again in 2019. And that's for towns greater than 50,000 in the state of Illinois. So think about that. We do a great job of keeping you safe. If you go to the next slide. So this is what I was talking about, the violent crimes per 1,000 population. You can see where Orland Park is all the way over at the left. The nice thing is Tinley Park's over there too, and so is Mokina. So the region is very safe because our police departments work together. Our residents report things. They see something, they say something. So that's really important. You look out to the right, you see where Chicago is and Rockford and some of these other towns, so you can see how much safer you are here in Orland Park. Go to the next slide. So I hear about it, the chief hears about it, Our village manager hears about the mall all the time. Crime at the mall, crime at the mall, crime at the mall. I just pointed out a couple slides ago, crime at the mall was down 35% from 2016 to 2019. So what you're hearing about crime at the mall, the facts are not, that's perception. And it's hard for me to battle emotion and perception. There's nothing I can do to change someone who emotionally is committed to the fact that the mall's not safe, other than to tell them, here are the facts. And the facts are, so who here thinks that Oak Brook is a safe mall? How many of you think that Oak Brook's safe? Woodfield? Most people think that Oak Brook and Woodfield are safe malls, and they are. Well, we have a organization that tracks crime at all of these malls, and they put it on a scale, and 100 would be the national average. Anything less than that means you're safer than that. Orland Square actually scores better than Oak Brook and Woodfield. So according to them, we're actually safer than two malls that everyone considers to be very safe. Go to the next slide. And if you go out to 6 miles from the mall, we're still better than the national average, and even better than some of that. Now, some of that's due to the fact that our mall's in the middle of town and we control the area around us, and some of their malls are at the edge of town and they don't necessarily control the towns next door to them. But the reality is that our mall is very safe. It's probably, when you consider the fact that we have officers there, whether you see them or not, we have officers there all the time, it's probably the place you're going to get, it is definitely the place you're going to get the quickest response. Because anything that happens there, we're there within a minute, because we have people there on site even if you don't see them. So statistically, it's given the volume of people that go through there, it might be the safest place in Orland Park, because there's that many people there, and we also have police there on a regular basis. So flip to the next slide. And we work really hard with the mall and our neighboring towns. So Orland Square upgraded all their lighting a couple of years ago and installed a new camera system we have access to 24/7. If you recall the unfortunate incident with the priest that ran over the person at Square Kelt, which is not the mall's property. It's actually the mall's cameras over 100 yards away that actually allowed us to solve that case. So that's how good their cameras are. So it's very helpful to us. We've entered into, like we talked about, intergovernmental agreement with Oak Forest, Tinley Park, Orland Hills, and Midlothian. I think we've added a couple to them as well. Palos Park and Palos Heights have joined the group as well. That's all to combat the car thefts. And we continually change our strategies. We're not going to announce those strategies as much as you might want to know what those are. We don't want the criminals to know what those are. So, but we do that, and I think the results speak for themselves. We have the lowest crime in Orland Park since 1994 last year, and again, it's lower this year. And again, that's a credit to the department, a credit to Chief Mitchell. Next slide. Now, one thing that's not up here is we've heard recently about the Sky Zone incident, and I'm just going to briefly talk about it because it could end up in front of me to adjudicate, so I can't really talk about the case other than to say it was initially a call that was a fight between 3 youths that were ticketed. Our officers got there and saw too many people in the building for what's allowed and made a call to, keep in mind, these are 10 to 17-year-old children. They emptied the place out into the parking lot and had those children call for rides home. Well, obviously, if you have almost 1,000 children that need rides home, you have an issue with crowd control. So we did call neighboring towns to help contribute some officers to help us control that crowd so that it did not spiral out of hand and so that those kids remained safe. And we did a great job with that. So that big response that you saw was not because 1,000 kids were fighting, it's because we needed to get 1,000 kids home safely. So our police department did an outstanding job with all of that. So I just want to make that clear. They have been ticketed. They will actually have a hearing next week, and that hearing goes in front of the village manager. And the village manager will rule, and they can appeal that ruling to the village board, which is why we really can't talk about the case other than what I just told you. So next I want to talk a little bit about fiscal issues. And I'm going to jump around a bit. You'll see on the slides, I kind of hit on a bunch of different fiscal issues that here in Orland Park because it's important to all of us. So how do property taxes work? So this slide shows you how property taxes work. They estimate the market value of your house. If you're a home, you get 10% of that value as your assessed value. If you're a business, 25% of that value. So that's why businesses pay so much more in taxes here in Cook County. Every other county in the state, it's equal. Here in Cook County, it's 2.5 times more for businesses. Then they apply a state equalizer factor, which no one really understands, but it's applied to your, it's basically to try and balance out how everybody's assessed. Then you end up with your assessed value. Then you put exemptions. So exemptions, you get a homeowner exemption of $7,000. Senior citizens, you get a $5,000 exemption. And then you can also, if your income's less than $55,000, you can get a freeze on your taxes. Okay, that gives you your adjusted value, and then your tax rates applied. That's based on the levies from all of your taxing bodies. Okay, and then they multiply that, and that gives you your tax bill. Next slide. So, and the reason why this is important is that the property tax on the same valued property can be very, very different. So on a $300,000 property value, a commercial building will pay $7,500 in taxes. A homeowner like me who's not a senior yet would pay $2,300. A senior homeowner would pay $1,800. So it's very, very different how people are taxed. So that's something to keep in mind with all these assessed values and all these property taxes. Somebody has to pick up the bill of these levies. These levies, we levy $13 million. That gets spread across everybody. So if a group of people's taxes go down, everybody else's goes up to cover that, because we still get whatever we levy. Next. So in the blue here, you will see the 2019, and I'm sorry that it's a little off there, the 2019 taxes, and the 2018 taxes are in the red, okay? You can see the total tax rate's gone up about 0.3%. And Orland Park was 6.47% of the total tax bill paid in 2020. You can see that the Village of Orland Park's rate has stayed the same in the 2 years. The increase that you see, the almost 0.25% increase, about 2/3 of that came from District 135, increasing their tax rate. And approximately almost 80% of your bill comes from the schools and the fire protection district. So in the big scheme of things, Orland Park has a very low tax rate, and that's largely because of our commercial base. And I know a lot of people complain about, oh, you're adding a business. We don't need more businesses. The reason we can keep that rate low and offer all the services we do is because of the businesses that we have. And you'll hear a lot of people, I'm sure many of you have heard, oh, let's get rid of the mall. The mall is probably 10 to 15% of our total tax base. Just the mall. And then the traffic it brings, it probably ends up contributing 40 to 50% of our total tax base. So that would be a disaster for Orland Park, because all the services we offer, we'd no longer be able to offer. That's why it's so important to keep them all safe, and why our police department spends so much time keeping it safe. Next slide. So one question I get a lot, and I get it a lot from seniors in particular, is about rebates. Why don't we have rebates anymore? So the reason that I'm showing this is because this is why we don't have rebates anymore. All those years that so the rebate's in blue, the debt that we took out that year is in red. So every year that we gave rebates, we were borrowing millions more and giving you some of that money back. So you're borrowing on your own credit card, you're paying the interest, you're paying the tax rates on it. To me, that makes no sense. How about we don't borrow, and we don't pay rebates, and we function with the taxes that we get, and don't try and fool you with some kind of a check that you're getting back. And the checks would always come, when did you get your checks, do you remember? March. What's the municipal election date? April. Okay, so that's kind of how it was being done. It was a shell game. So we've just stopped doing that. So that's what we'll do. And in the future, what we'll do is we'll lower the overall property tax rather than doing rebates. If it comes time where we have an excess of money, which in the COVID year probably is not going to happen, we're going to just lower your taxes. Next slide. So one of the things in 2017 that I was aware of, that I became aware of after becoming mayor, is we have a desired reserve level of 20%. And that's for times like this when, suddenly we lose a lot of revenue, we can dip into that reserve fund and cover us in a crisis, okay? So that's been our desired reserve fund. The 2017, these were the projections that were there in 2017, okay? The 2018 budget was projected to go down below 15%, or go down to 15%. By the time we got to 2023, we were not only going to not have a reserve at all, we were going to be negative 8.1%. So we're going to be borrowing, basically, is what we're going to be doing. So we had to do some things to fix that. And in 2017 and 2018, in particular, and then a little bit in the 2019 budget, we implemented an early retirement so that we could reduce our head count. We made some other custom programs. So some of the programs that maybe you might miss, but very few people used, we had to eliminate those, or we had to change how we did some things. And as you can see, our 2020 budget, we not only had in 2020, we still maintain, instead of being at 6.7% reserve, we actually had a 31% reserve. Also, all the way out to 2024, we're still in pretty good shape. Now, in those out years, we will make other adjustments so that we continue to keep our reserve level. But that was some really important decisions that we made to keep us fiscally healthy, because we were headed for a cliff. And that was scary about the slide is those numbers were known since like 2012, and nothing had been done to address it. So we've addressed it, which is very good. Next slide. The reason for this, pensions. Pensions are strangling our budget. They're strangling the school district's budgets. They're strangling the fire district's budget, the Illinois budget. But this is to give you an idea of how much between 2008 and 2018, and I don't have the latest numbers, but it's similar. You'll see that our payroll, so this is what we're paying people, increased 2.68% for police. But our pension liabilities increased 8.23% every year. And our annual contribution to those pensions, 9.36%, it increased every year. Obviously, that's not sustainable. Same thing with all the rest of our people are in a fund called the IMRF. Their payroll only went up 2.3%, but our liabilities went up 7.7%, and our contribution went up 4.5% every year. You just can't sustain that. And that's why pensions really need to be addressed at the state level. It's not something we can address at our level. The only way we can address it is to do what we did. Early retirement, get people who are in the older pension system off the books, who are near retirement, and get younger people who are in the newer retirement system that's a little bit healthier into the workforce. And then also to reduce headcount. That's really the only thing we can do to control that. Next slide. So one of the questions I get a lot now too is about the fair tax, what the governor calls it. I call it a progressive tax. That requires the voters to pass an amendment to the Illinois Constitution. This is coming up. So I just want to give you the facts on this. So these are the marginal rates that, according to the governor and the state, that they will pass on to people. So if you're 0 to 10,000, your marginal rates will go from 4.95, which it is currently, to 4.75. And on down the list. Now, the interesting thing is here is in 2011, your rates were 3%. So it's not like, so they basically have increased your rates and now they're going to give you a little sliver, little itty bitty sliver back. These rates are the current proposal. Once that amendment is passed, they can change these things to whatever they want, which they could do now, but they would have to do it to everybody. So they can target individual groups and do it to that group, and then do it to that group, and then do it to, so they can do that if they choose to. The other thing that's interesting about this is marriage is penalized. So you actually get taxed more if you're married than if you're not. Next slide. I'll just give you, my thoughts. The state has a revenue problem, or does not have a revenue problem. It has a spending problem. In 2018, the collections were $45.1 billion versus 32.7 in 2011, yet we still had a deficit. So all of these increased revenues, and we still spend more than we take in. The last time we had a truly balanced budget, not balanced via debt, was 2001. Our long-term debt's gone from 57 billion in 2008 to 215 billion in 2018. I think it's like 233 billion now. Again, it's pensions. Pension liabilities were 2.5 billion in 1970. Now they're over 133 billion. And unfunded liabilities were 601% of our overall revenues. We basically borrow money year after year to pay the pension obligations. And a good example, the lottery was supposed to be for education, and it's being used for pensions. So everything's getting sucked into pensions so it has to be addressed. The recent governor's budget, the one that was, not this most recent one, but the one before that, has 25 new programs at the cost of $635 million and added about $3.5 billion spending on 38 existing programs, again, via debt, or in the hopes that this gets passed. Next slide. So the state does have a history of not keeping its promises. So 2011 was a temporary tax bill that I was talking about. The individual rates were 3%. They went up to 5% from 2011 to 2014. Then they were supposed to go back to 3.75 in 2015. They did. And then they were supposed to go back to 3.25% in 2025. Well, in 2015 it went to 3.75, and then as soon as we had a new governor, they went back up to 4.95. So much for temporary. But what's really important that most people don't know is that we have what we call the Local Government Distributive Fund. Way back when income tax was put in place, 10% of that money was shared with municipalities. And the idea behind that was so that municipalities would never install an income tax, particularly Chicago. And all the municipalities agreed to that. And this was 40, 50 years ago that this happened. So it was 10% forever until 2011. When they passed this temporary tax, they reduced that to 6. Then in 2015, it went back up to 8. Then in 2017, they reduced it back to 5.45. And then they said, oh, we're gonna increase it for you in 2019. And they raised it to 5.65. Now you'll hear, oh, we've fully restored the LGDF to 6%. Fully restored it to this, not to this. To give you an idea how much impact that has on Orland Park, $2.7 million last year. That's how much it cost us, that they didn't give us. And if you think about Orland Park, $2.7 million, say a town like Harvey, it's about half our size, that's about $1.3 million, because this is done per capita. So think about a town like Harvey, $1.3 million, they're letting police officers and fire personnel go. So they're public safety because they can't afford to pay them. And the state's taking their money. Orland Park can absorb it. A lot of our neighbors can't. So again, the state doesn't keep its promises. Next. So now I'm going to briefly talk about infrastructure, and then I think we'll leave plenty of time for questions on all of these issues. So one of the things that we've really worked hard on in the last 18 months is infrastructure investment in our parks and on our roads. So this slide shows that back in 2017, when we assessed all of our roads and assessed all the condition of all of our roads. So for those of you who think we use politics to decide which roads get done, we actually do not. We actually have 240 different areas that we look at for roads, and we have a ranking system of how they scored. And some of them scored very poorly, some of them scored poor, and then on up. As you can see, we had over 40% of our roads were in poor or very poor condition. Now, we were spending about $4 million or a little bit less per year. If we were to continue that, we would still have similar conditions of our roads in 2023. And having walked those roads while knocking on doors and such, there's some areas that are really in poor condition. And the problem too, if you let them get too poor, they become more expensive to fix, because now we have to completely rebuild the roads as opposed to doing what you see, the resurfacing. We're doing that right now in Fernway. I think it was an 8, 9, 10-year project, because we just can't do the whole subdivision at one time because they're just so expensive. So they've been getting a few roads completely redone every year because they've just gone too far, too long, and they had to be completely redone. So next slide. So what we decided to do in 2019 and 2020 is we increased the spending that we did, and we got close to the $8 million a year. And this shows you what happens spending $8 million a year, what happens to our roads. All those very poor roads by 2023, we don't have any more that are in very poor condition. And the ones in poor condition, so we're, instead of at 40% poor or very poor, we're just a little over 20. That's manageable. We can actually stay up with our roads that way, because we need to spend enough to get to our roads every 18 years or so. That's about how long the life cycle of a road lasts. And I know that a lot of you don't like to see crack sealing, but that actually extends the life of the road. Pothole repairs extends the life of the road. Then we do a complete resurface. If you do, beyond that, now you're talking about a complete rebuild. We try to avoid the complete rebuild part, because that gets very, very expensive. Okay? And we have to look across, and I know everyone thinks their roads are the worst. We know which roads are the worst because we had them all analyzed, and we've been going down that list. By doing this, the road, we're already 4 years ahead. Just the last 2 years, we're 4 years ahead of the previous program. So we're already doing roads that were planned for 2024. So this extra money that we've put at this has made a huge difference. And hopefully, you know, some of you have seen your neighborhoods done. Next slide. Now this is a map of the neighborhoods that have been done in the last 2 years. So as you can see, I hear this a lot too, that we don't do anything on my part of town, we don't do anything on my part of town. I hear that from every part of town. Well, you can see that actually we do go all throughout town, and what you see is you see a big cluster kind of in the Catalina Gulfview area, just because those areas when they were built, it's just their life cycle, it's their term, and they're in worse condition. So, but you can see all the different areas that we've hit. We've hit a lot in the last 2 years, and we will continue to do that. The other thing that we did is we put a 1-inch overlay on Wheeler. Wheeler was actually slated to be completely redone. We haven't redone it for a reason, but it was bad with potholes. So we did a 1-inch overlay to buy us 3 or 4 years because we have a water system project that's going to tear up Wheeler. Didn't make any sense to rebuild it and then rebuild it again 4 years later. So when that water project goes through, the road will be rebuilt as part of that. Next slide. So the other thing we've invested a lot in is our parks. And we have 66 parks, and open spaces, so we have a lot of parks. And if you looked at parks, what you'll hear is every 20 years they need to be redone. Well, that's like 3 a year or a little over that. We've been doing far less than that. So these are the parks, existing parks with major work done on them. And you can kind of see what that number is. If you look back over the previous 10 years, it's about half of a park a year on average. Well, at that pace, it would take us over a century to get to all our parks. Obviously, that's not fast enough. Next slide. So here again, these are our new parks and our renovated parks. So renovated parks, we had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 over an 11-year period, so a little more than half a year. Again, that's not going to cut it. The new parks were part of new subdivisions that came in where money was contributed to us to build those parks, so we built those new parks. Next slide. So what we did is we went out and had all of the parks rated, just like we did with the roads. We had an independent company come out and rate all of our parks. And this is the overall ratings they came up with for these parks. There's 54 of them on here, because some of our parks are open spaces, some of our major parks weren't looked at as heavily. So if you look at this, you'll see a score average across. They looked at security, they looked at accessibility, which includes ADA requirements, and one of the things with our older parks is the ADA requirements have changed, so they don't necessarily meet the new ADA requirements. So if we go out and start doing work on them, we have to bring them up to today's standard. And then the general condition of the parks. So you'll see that listed here. And you'll see that we have a lot of parks in that orangish color. There's a lot of different areas that are in that orange color. So we were addressing maybe 1 park a year at best. And so how are we going to actually, so the thought was, how are we actually going to get to all of these parks? 1 a year, it's going to be a decade before we even put a dent in any of this, and now we're going to have a lot more things that are in poor condition. So we had to look at doing things a different way. So rather than doing complete rebuilds, what we decided is, let's start focusing on the stuff that's in poor condition. If you have a park that's 20 years old, but the equipment's still in good shape and it's very safe, why replace it? We need to focus on safety and what's in poor condition. And by spreading our money that way, we can actually address what's in poor condition and keep the rest of the parks intact and use our money more wisely. We also invested about double the money in it, but just like we did with our roads, but we're attacking it in a different way. Over a 5-year period, all the things you see here in orange will be addressed over 5 years. Much different approach than what's been done in the past. Next slide. So this year was the first year we were able to implement that, and here's a good example. So John Humphrey Complex is a little bit different animal because it's a major. We have 3 major complexes: Schuessler, John Humphrey, and Centennial. And so John Humphrey, for those of you who don't know this, it pretty much became unusable for its original purpose, which was baseball and softball, because the fields had too big of a drop-off. They weren't safe. Even 15 years ago, when my son was playing travel baseball, we stopped playing on those fields because it was unsafe for them to do so. There was a 7-foot drop-off on the big field from home plate to center. If you had a 10-year-old out there, you actually couldn't see him. out in the outfield because he was so low relative to where you were standing in the dugout. It's just a very, it just wasn't in good shape. And it was built in the 80s, and it was, to 80s standards, and it was really what it was. It was a fill pile, and we spread it out and made a park out of it, which was a good idea at the time. But over that period of time, over 30 years, things changed, and we needed to do something with it. So the board, in 2019 and then in this year in 2020 has invested a ton of money into John Humphrey, has redone all the fields, we've redone the concession area, and if you go out and you can go out and look out the back window here, I'm looking at some of it now, you can see how the fields look, they look beautiful, and next spring we'll be able to start using them. So we did that, but on top of that, we put 7 new shade pavilions up, we did 7 park renovations instead of 1. 10 basketball courts got resurfaced. I think 3 of them were complete rebuilds. We had 8 tennis and pickleball courts. I think 3 of those were complete rebuilds. We were able to do that because we spread the money around instead of just devoting on one park. And I know some people are upset because their park didn't get completely done and it was their turn. Well, I'd rather see a lot of the residents benefit than just one small park each year because our grandkids won't be here by the time we get to the last park if we do it that way. So we need to change how we did things, and we did. Next slide. So that pretty much concludes the presentation today. Now, what questions do you have for us or for Chief Mitchell?
I had a friend driving through near where
Sky Zone?
Sky Zone and Gizmos. And she said, Sky Zone is closed, but when she drove by at 6:30 p.m. the other night, there were kids coming out of there and they were hanging on the hoods of cars as they were pulling out. A lot of cars pulling out. And there were kids hanging on the windows and the hoods of the cars as they pulled out.
So
And I told her, you should have called the police.
Well, that's exactly right. If you see something like that, we don't know it's there if you don't call. So if you see something, say something. But Sky Zone is not closed. Sky Zone has been ticketed, and they will be at a hearing with the village manager George here next Wednesday.
One of those places.
Yeah, but Sky Zone is still open at this particular
Okay.
juncture.
Yeah, but I did tell her to call.
Chief, do you have something to?
No, please just call.
Just call. We'll address it.
That's what I said.
So, we have 22 square miles to cover with, a relatively small police force. I mean, how many beat patrol people? 11 at a time?
Typically 8 to 12 people on the street at any given time, so.
It's a lot of area to cover, so we have to hear about it. Okay. Next question. Anybody else?
How did you get the Pete's grocery market? Suppose it was slated to go in the old Kmart on the 159th in Harlem. Now I hear it's going to be over here in LaGrange.
So the question is, how do we get Pete's Market? It was slated to go into the old Kmart, now it's coming over to LaGrange. I don't think the Kmart thing is changing. I think they're opening several stores, and grocery stores, people don't travel 7 miles usually to go to grocery stores. So I think Pete's Market has been interested in Orland Park for a long time. I think, I'm not going to revisit the history, but what the deal went south some years ago over at 143rd. They own a couple properties in Orland Park, including they still own that old Terry's Lincoln Mercury site. But Art Van left, and so it presented them an opportunity. We reached out to them, identifying that opportunity. George actually brought it up, so we reached out to him. Trustee Katsinas reached out to him. I reached out to him. We had, and it went very, very quickly. I mean, I can't think of anything that went any quicker than that. As far as, we want you here, they want to be here, and so now it looks like they'll start construction next year, and they'll open spring of 2022. So I think it's great for the area. It's a different, I've heard this one too, we don't need more grocery stores. It's a different type of grocery store than the other grocery stores we have. So it's going to give people more choices.
One more question. All of us sitting on our group right here, mall walking, we've been walking the mall for years. They used to open at 7 o'clock for us, and now they don't. Any way that, I don't know if you have any influence with Simon.
I don't have any influence on that. Simon does know that as far as Orland Park's concerned, on July 6th, we adopted our opening plan because the downstate downstate ruling that threw out all the executive orders from the governor. We adopted our plan on July 6th. We adopted it into the phase that was equivalent to the phase that the state of Illinois was in at that time. We used 14 days as the guidelines, like everywhere else in the country. The state's using 28, but everywhere else in the country they use 14. And we moved into the final phase because we met all of the milestones. So as far as Orland Park's concerned, businesses are allowed to be completely open. Now they still have to potentially deal with the state. They have to deal with their customers. They have to do what they think is right. So really it's up to Simon, and they know that. My suggestion to you would be to go talk to the mall manager at Simon and ask them, and they have to make a business decision for themselves. But there's not really much we can do about that, other than they're aware that they're allowed to be fully open. But you can go walk at the Sportsplex. We do have a walking track there. We also have it at the Levy Center, but I think the biggest one is the Sportsplex. So.
Mayor, do you know if Carson Fury Scott will ever come back to the mall?
The question is, will Carson Fury Scott ever come back to the mall? That one I can definitively say, no, they will not. They are out of business. So they're completely bankrupt. They're not coming back to anywhere, any place. And oh, by the way, we have a much better store in there by Mauer. So that actually helps the mall in general, because Carson's was similar product mix to Macy's. Now hopefully we get Macy's to invest a little more in their store and pay a little more attention to it. But now you have kind of with Penny's and Von Mauer and Carson and Macy's, you have 3 different product mixes, which is better than having 2 stores with the same product mix. So it's actually healthier for the mall in the long run. And Von Mauer is a great store.
Does anything happen with that Sears building?
The Sears building, we're still in the same position we were in 2018 when we approved this. I think it was 2018. Yeah, it was February 2018. We approved the AMC.
It's coming soon.
Yeah, right. But they were supposed to start construction in April. COVID hit. AMC, movie theaters have been, decimated by this, and then it doesn't help that they're not allowed to open as well, so it's really made it challenging for them. So as far as I have conversations still regularly, and AMC still committed to the lease and still committed to the space. The question is going to be when. Originally, they wanted to be open by Avatar 2. Avatar 2's been slipped, so we don't know exactly when we're looking for construction. We've passed some incentives to hopefully encourage them to build sooner. And we'll see what happens with that. But as of now, it's still planned to be an AMC and then a fitness below, and then they're still working on leasing everything else. Anyone looking for new leases with companies right now, it's a challenge, because everyone's trying to figure out how to survive through the COVID crisis. Okay, we have an email question here. Mayor Pekau discussed the downsides for the debt in the previous years. However, this debt was issued for a reason. Did the debt help to establish the infrastructure for the businesses, which you just said were vital to keeping our property taxes low? Was it issued to the LaGrange construction project? Also, the debt wasn't issued. Wouldn't the pension problem be greater? Pensions are independent of the debt issued. Well, regarding the pension problem is a pension problem. That has nothing to do with debt. We have to pay a lot more in pensions than and we're not borrowing to deal with pensions. The state's borrowing for pensions. So the debt, by and large, so our long-term debt in 1998 was about $13 million. And I'll go back to, I left here in 1983, came back in 1998. Our debt was $13 million in 1998. From 1983 to 1998, this building was built, Village Hall was built, none of this existed. John Humphrey Complex was built. Centennial Park West was built. The new police station, well, what I called then the new police station over here, which is now Parks and Rec, was under construction when I left. We built a public works facility. In 1998, we were building Sportsplex. So we had done all that construction from 1983 to 1998, and we'd only added $13.5 million in debt. We also built all the roads associated with that. So to me, that's a good use of debt. We were, with all that capital that we did, and we only added $13 million, that's pretty good. From 1998 to 2016, we went from 13 million to 158 million in long-term debt, and all we added during that time was the new police station. Where a lot of that money went was to the Triangle, and we're very deep in debt with that still. We're not going to get that money back, so it's just something we have to climb out. The good news is that for the last 2 years, we've taken about last 3 years, we've taken about $50 million of that back off the books. So we've done a great job with that, and we haven't issued new debt. So now with some of these capital investments we're making, we are going to add a little bit of debt. But when you've taken 50 million off and you borrow at 2.2%, adding 10 is not, we're still making great strides. We're still net, improved our debt position by about 40, and we're getting all our roads fixed and all our parks fixed. So I think that's a much more constructive use of debt. In my opinion, it's better to spend it on infrastructure than to spend it on development projects that the private sector can do. That's just my personal belief. And I think currently that's the board's belief, because that's the direction we've taken as a board. Some members of the board may disagree, but as a whole, that's what the board's voted to do. Other questions?
We do have one question that came in on Facebook. So would you consider during the pandemic when funds are low, engraving a veteran's name on the wall for free this year?
So we don't engrave veterans' names for free. The engravings actually help pay for the Veterans Memorial. It also helps pay for, it's how our veterans programs are funded, is through engravings, it's through the golf outing and all of that. That's how we pay for all of the other things we're able to do. So I believe it's $250 to do that. It costs us about $100 to engrave each one. So what that does is it helps pay. $100 includes the cost of the granite and all of that at the end of the day. So that's used to help do the steak fry and the fish fry and all of those other things that we do.
Is there any plans on doing anything with that triangle?
So the Triangle, we were very close within a week or two of having a master development agreement signed with the developer at that point. And then COVID hit, and then the developer's kind of gone quiet. So we're currently negotiating with them to find out if they're still interested in the deal or not. Personally, and again, I'm just speaking personally here, I would rather see the 9 acres stay the way that it is than build something that's not the right thing for the long term for the village. So ideally, I'd like to see it developed. So don't take that as I don't want it developed. But I just, and it's been a focus, and we were that close. We took a different approach than has been taken in the past. In the past, we've had we built apartment buildings, we built University of Chicago, we built a parking deck. We never had an actual developer with an entire plan, which is really the way that things should be developed. And so this time, that's how we went. We went out to the marketplace, and we had two people that we thought had good plans, and we asked them to go forward, and then we chose one. And that one, again, it's gone quiet because of COVID, and we just have to wait and see how that shakes out.
What are the other businesses going in at 151st and LaGrange?
You mean the old Toys R Us site? So Chipotle is moving over there, and then Whole Foods will expand into the Chipotle space, is our understanding. Panera is moving over there because they want to drive through, which means there will be a vacant space in Panera. I don't know what's planned for that, or if there is a plan for that yet. We also have a Raising Cane's also, which is a chicken tenders and that kind of thing. Very popular apparently. Again, with a drive-through. Then there's another spot that's vacant still with a drive-through, and then there's the big anchor that they had, the big anchor restaurant. That anchor restaurant has put all their Illinois plans on hold at the present time. So they're still looking to fill that, and I think that's going to be the last building they add. But basically, it's going to be 5. They're planning on 5 restaurants at the present time. Any other questions? Dr. Joe, you don't have any questions?
No, everything's been answered.
No other questions on development or what we have going forward, or?
It's been great. Can I say thank you for everything you've done?
Sure, I always appreciate thank you, so I appreciate that. Any questions from our staff that's here? Since we have another 20 minutes scheduled. I really want to thank our staff for putting this all together. I want to thank our folks from Rec for coming over and helping serve all of this. I know we don't have a huge crowd here today, largely because of COVID. Hopefully people people clearly are online because they're asking questions, which is great. As always, we've tried to provide everyone with options. So some of you felt comfortable coming here, some of you didn't or couldn't, and so you're able to watch it online. You can also watch it later tonight. So we try to do that to provide everyone the options that they're comfortable with, and we've done a great job of that all year. I also want to thank my assistant Diana for her hard work, and Marissa and Nabia. So I want to thank everyone for all their hard work on this. Thanks to Chief Mitchell for coming out and for doing such a phenomenal job. So give him a round of applause. I can't overemphasize the outstanding work that our police department does. The rioting and looting that went on in the area was real. The threat to us was real. And it was our reaction to that stopped it from happening, because they were here. There were people here trying to get into our mall, trying to get into our retailers. And keep in mind, our mall had just opened 2 days prior to that. And we had to go in and say, hey, you need to shut down. And they did. Our businesses had been closed, and they just opened back up, and they shut down. And so we worked really hard. It was all hands on deck. I believe we had one officer that was 4 hours into a vacation, a motorcycle trip, and he got the call that everyone was being called in. He turned around and came back. Because that's what our officers think of Orland Park, and try and keep it safe. So our entire staff, our public works staff, came in and put trucks in front of some of these locations. The fire department, which is not under our jurisdiction, we reached out to them, and they were there. They brought their trucks, they put those in front of places, and all of that was done. It was a team effort to keep us safe. It really, really was. And the good news is people don't realize it. They're like, oh, nothing really happened. And nothing happened because the team effort that was there. It was an all hands on deck team effort. And I was there, I saw it, and I was in the middle of it for a good 7-8 hours that we were really under siege, and we just did a phenomenal job. And our neighbors did as well, and they communicated well, because some of our neighbors that were a little bit further away, they got hit. And fortunately, right around here we did not. So it was great work by everyone, by everyone, by our village manager, by our police department. Everyone did a phenomenal job. So I got to give them hats off for that. Well, if there's no other questions, I got you out of here early. So, which I'm surprised there's as many slides as we had today. So thank you very much for coming. Thank you for those of you who are watching it live on either Facebook or on our live stream. And thanks for all the questions. They're great questions. And if you have any other questions, feel free to email myself, email George Kazwar, our village manager, or Chief Mitchell, and we'll try and answer them as best we can. Thank you.